This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software. If slow QA processes bottleneck you or your software engineering team and you're releasing slower because of it, you need to check out QAWolf.com. QA Wolf gets engineering teams to 80% automated end-to-end test coverage and helps them ship 5 times faster by reducing QA cycles from hours to minutes. With over 100 5-star reviews on G2 and customer testimonials from SalesLoft, Drata, AutoTrader, and many more, you're in good hands. Go to QAWolf.com to see if they can help you squash the QA bottleneck.
Welcome to Software Engineering Radio. I'm your host, Giovanni Asproni, and today I'll be discussing architecture modernization with Nick Tune and Jean-Georges Perrin. Nick works with product and technology leaders to map strategy, model domains, design architecture, and build continuous delivery teams. He's the author of Principles and Practices of Domain-Driven Design and co-author with Jean-Georges Perrin of Architecture Modernization. Jean-Georges is JGP for short. Is the Chief Innovation Officer at Abea Data, the chair of the Open Data Contract Standard, is a co-founder of the IDA user group and author of multiple books, including Implementing Data Mesh, Spark in Action 2nd edition, and of course, Architecture Modernization with Nick. Nick and Jean-Georges, welcome to Software Engineering Radio. Is there anything I missed that you would like to add?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having us. Just to show off a little bit, I'm also a lifetime IBM champion. I'm a PayPal champion, and recently I've been Data Mesh MVP. And MVP stands for Most Valuable Player, not Minimum Viable Product here.
Nick, anything to add?
I think I came like third in the 100 meters at primary school at sports day once.
You beat me.
So let's talk now about the subject of this podcast. So about architecture modernization. So let's start with some context for our listeners. So my first question is, what is architecture modernization as you propose it? Is it a set of activities, is a process, is a methodology, or something else?
So the general concept is, as we build software systems, they get older and the world around us changes. New technologies become available, new patterns and practices and ways of doing architecture become available. Our company's business model changes. And so we have a software system that is quite behind what's possible in the modern day. So modernization is really removing those disadvantages of the old systems by using modern practices, technologies, and thinking, I would say. So it's really a topic or a theme. I wouldn't say it's a process. I wouldn't say it's a technology. I wouldn't say it's a very specific thing. It's just the process or the act of doing something in a general sense.
Okay. So is it aimed at large-scale changes or incremental improvements? Because from reading the book, the way it is described, there is also the concept of creating a group of people that will supervise these changes and will help the teams in doing this. So reading it seems to be a large-scale endeavor and something that is a kind of a big thing. Or is it more incremental improvements in day-to-day work?
Well, I think it depends on the context. But I mean, for a lot of companies, nobody wants to do modernization. Nobody wants to spend 3-5 years fixing their legacy systems. But at the same time, business leaders want to be able to build new products, to expand to new customer segments and new countries. And when the legacy system doesn't allow you to do that, sometimes you have to do large-scale changes. Obviously, we would all prefer to do smaller day-to-day changes. And if you have good discipline and good practices, and you don't build up technical debt, yeah, you can do this on a more gradual, ongoing basis and not need to do big projects.
Okay, and it's also kind of one-off activity or an ongoing one, or a bit of both. You know, what I mean is, does it have a kind of a start and an ending, and then you say, now we have a modern architecture, or, you know, it's something that you continuously do to keep the architecture somehow relevant?
I mean, there might be periods where we're doing more or less modernization. The more technical debt we build up, the more difficult our legacy systems become to work with, the more we have to invest in those. So there might be a period where the company's talking about modernizing, and then when the system becomes less of a bottleneck, less of a blocker to the business, we stop talking about that. So there's not really an end date. Not really a start date either, but there are exceptions. One of the case studies in the book is OpenTable. They did a big modernization around 2012, around that time period. They basically stopped all product development work, did this big modernization project for 9 months, and then carried on again as normal. So you can do it that way, but most of the time it's more of a fuzzy thing with big peaks and then starts to taper out maybe. And there's always this ongoing continuing to add product features versus doing modernization work. That's usually a difficult topic. That's always a challenge, especially when it comes to OKRs and roadmaps and everything.
Yeah, because I guess everybody wants to have a system with more features that serves more customer needs. And so spending time on modernization seems to be kind of maybe a cost more than something that will enable future business, I would imagine. At least this is the perception that some have.
Yeah, it's an investment, yeah.
Yes. So it looks to me that it's kind of a bit of both, a one-off activity and ongoing one. And this depends very much on the current context of the system. So some kind of periods of big modernization efforts, then work as usual, maybe the team trying to keep the technical debt under control, and then again, potentially another big effort, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think it's a business question. What does your business want to achieve? Are you looking to expand into new countries? How difficult, how expensive would it be to do that? With your current systems, it might not be possible. So that would be the driver of the scope. What are the business goals, and how does the current system constrain those goals?
Yeah, okay. And another aspect, you say that modern software architecture is socio-technical, so involves both technological and social aspects. How does that affect the architecture modernization choices and decisions? What I mean is how these social and technological aspects work with each other.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, we have to make decisions about which team own which parts of the system. And that can actually have an impact on how we design a system. Sometimes there are different ways to slice your architecture. And the way to think about that is if we slice it up in one way and we had teams owning this bit and this bit versus slicing it another way and teams owning different bits, what would allow teams to work more independently so that they're not blocked or having to coordinate their work? And we can also think from a reliability perspective, which way of slicing the architecture and the teams is likely to result in the fewest bugs. So that might involve doing some domain-driven design and looking at what do we consider transactions to be? Which bits of data do we need to update atomically? That will shape our architecture boundaries and our team boundaries.
In terms of these two aspects, is there one that is more important than the other? Like, are social aspects more or less important than the technology one, or they are at the same level? What would you say in your experience?
It's hard to really say that one's more important than the other. I think both need to be done really well. I wouldn't like to say either one's easy. So no, I wouldn't pick either one. I would say both are difficult challenges. And the actual problem is how to do a joint optimization to find a compromise that spans across both the organization and the software.
Okay.
If I may add to that a little bit, it also depends on where you are in the project, because the socio aspect to your project or to your modernization, whether it's software or data, you may feel it differently at different time of your project. Okay. So first, at the very beginning, it's a business decision, as Nick said, and you've got to go through acceptance of that part. So there's already a bit of socio going on there. And then as you roll out your architecture, methods are changing. And then when you use a magic change word, okay, you've got to coach people with this change. And that's also where the socio aspect is really important.
Yeah.
And in my experience, I think it's often undermined.
Yeah. And talking about these things, I'd like to know if you, from your experience, so now, of course, when we talk about social aspects, there is always Conway's law that comes in play. Yeah, so for our listeners, is basically Conway's law says that the shape of the team structure follows the shape of the system being built. Now, usually, when we talk about Conway's law, we talk from a system perspective, say this is the architecture. Now, this is how the teams should be structured to implement this system according to this design. Have you seen in some companies, maybe you can have some examples of doing the other thing, like this is a team structure we have that we cannot change, and so we need to match the architecture to what we've got in terms of structure. Have you ever seen anything like that?
Yeah, so I have worked in the UK government, and they were doing a digital transformation, and the digital bit was being built by this new digital organization, and they had their own CTO, and the internal facing stuff, owning a lot of the legacy systems and databases, that was owned by the enterprise IT team, who had their own CTO. And so when you're building a digital service, and digital usually means customer facing, UI, website, front end. When you're implementing a new feature, your data has to come from somewhere. When you want to store data, you have to store it somewhere. And so a feature runs all the way from UI, from front office to back office. You've got the integration in between, the databases I talked about. So yeah, I was on this project. We had this problem. I gave some talks about this almost 10 years ago now, actually. And we proposed to change the architecture so that we didn't have this dependency like this front and back. On the front, we were all doing stuff in-house, sitting together in an agile way. The back-end bits, they were outsourcing lots of it to different vendors using different technology stacks. So very difficult to collaborate. When a feature crossed this organizational boundary, it was very difficult to even help. A lot of coordination was needed. So we proposed a restructuring, but that would have meant one of these CTOs would have to give something to the other one. And they were both fighting to become the global overall CTO. So neither of them wanted to obviously give away anything. It was all about power structure, very dominated by politics.
That's interesting. This is where the social aspects actually really were the most important thing in this case. So even if maybe a system designed differently, changing the structure would be more efficient to use, maybe easier to support still. The way that there was this structure there that nobody wanted to change.
Some bits were flexible, but some bits were not. And the two different departments were going in completely different directions. That would make it harder to change different tech stacks, different ways of working. It wouldn't have been possible to bring it together later on either.
How did you manage to deliver this project? Must have been really hard.
Yeah, it was quite difficult. There were situations where we were building this new UI and we wanted to change the user experience. Like we had user researchers. They were going out every week talking to citizens of the UK. They were involving developers. They were presenting these videos of all the user research sessions. And we were like, oh, it's amazing. So many things we can improve and make our citizens happy. And it would be like, let's add a new bit of data on this page. Let's add some more data. Let's collect a bit of information over here. And then we started to hit these blockers. And it's like, well, we have this legacy database, which sits in a DMZ owned by a different vendor. And the XML schema is here. And it passes through these different systems. So if you want to change the schema, you have to update it in 4 places. You need to pay a vendor like tens of thousands of pounds just to give you a quote for how much it will fix. So yeah, you just can't improve the product. And I think people started to call this lipstick on a pig. You can do these digital services, but if you can't actually change the business rules and the data and make those deep improvements, you're just putting a new website on an old legacy system, which has some benefits, but not as much as it could be having.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about this maybe later also when we talk a bit how to go with implementing an architecture modernization program, because these kind of problems seem to be potential showstoppers. Now, a question about the architecture modernization approach you propose in the book. Now, there are other also books about improving legacy systems, modernizing architectures in a way. What is different in what you propose compared to what was already there?
I don't really think there was much there, to be honest. I don't really think there's a lot of content out there on this topic. There are books that talk about refactoring, like Michael Feather's working with legacy code. But this book really isn't about that on a tactical implementation level. It's more on what are all of the dots you need to put together to do modernization successfully. So I was writing blog posts about this for a number of years, the different aspects, thinking about how this all fits together. I didn't really see that much out there. And the book doesn't really talk about an approach or a framework. The book covers the different topics you need to think about to do modernization well, from a strategic level to an architecture level to a migration level, but it doesn't say a specific way of doing things. It recommends techniques like Wardley mapping and event storming and DDD, but you don't have to use those. And there's no certification. It's not a step-by-step process. It's more tools and how you can fit them together.
And I guess the way I see it is also basically doesn't stop simply at what you need to do at the code base. It's more general, what you need to do at the system broadly defined. Also, what you've got around your software system or the organization, how it works, how people work together and skills and everything else. So it seems to be more general than the typical things you read about refactoring systems on improving architecture.
Yeah, it's not a refactoring book. It's not many technical patterns in there. There is some stuff on DDD. There is some stuff around how you can migrate from your old to your new architecture. Typically, you're going to be using some form of the strangler fig with an incremental migration. So you've got your new system and your old system running in parallel, and you're moving bits across. And you have to ask questions like, do we migrate the reads or the writes first? So we can take a bit out of the legacy. Maybe it's a part of your website and it's presenting some data, but the information still comes into your system from the legacy. So you have to have some synchronization between those two. So it touches on those migration patterns. It shows how you can do things like software design event storming and what that would look like in your code. But yeah, it's not a detailed book about refactoring patterns.
Yeah. Okay. Now, if we go into a bit more detail, so basically, as we said, looks at all aspects of the system. And so as I understand it, this approach is about potentially revisiting pretty much everything around the old system. Technologies, the design, the features, the team structure, the team skills, as opposed to doing the same things but better somehow. So it's kind of revisiting things and having a better look at what we are doing with our system and see how we can have a better one, more modern in many respects. But now I have a question about what kind of criteria we can use to decide in our system that if we want to modernize it, which aspects to revisit and which aspects to keep the same.
Yeah, so some of the aspects we might want to revisit are the UI, for example. Do we just fix the code or do we make some UI improvements as well? Like the government example I talked about. Something else we might ask is, do we make some improvements to the domain model and the data model? The simplest or the lowest version might be you just rebuild the old system in a new tech. But if your code's tightly coupled and poorly designed, you're going to bring that into the new version. So you might also decide to improve your domain model. Domain model is how you represent business concepts in your code. It's the language you use. As systems get older, very often the way people talk about the product doesn't match the words used in the software. Very generically, we might talk about things like a customer, but in the code, we might use words like a client. That's a simple example, but over time, we get these mismatches. So that's one of the areas we can invest in a domain model. And for me, the question is always, what's the business potential? We need to understand if we could completely modernize the UX, completely refactor our code and make it a perfect domain model, what would that be worth? How much would it cost? And then we can do that on a case-by-case basis for different parts of our system and work out what's the best ROI for each area. In some cases, it might just be lift and shift to the cloud. And in some cases, it might be a complete revamp from the code infrastructure, UX, domain model.
What about, team structure, team skills, and all these kind of aspects as well? How do you decide that? Does it come after you decide, well, ideally the domain model and potentially the architecture? Is this the ideal situation?
Yeah, so as we're thinking about the new architecture and what the new boundaries will be, we have to start thinking, how do we break up our business and how might we structure our teams around the architecture? So those three things are always the same equation.
Okay. So you mentioned UI, user experience, domain model. So of all these many aspects, are there some that are special in the sense that you always want to revisit them?
Probably not. No, I don't think anything is always Sometimes you might keep your existing software and you might just change the code. You might fix some of the most complex bits in your legacy. Sometimes you might change the tech and not much change in the actual design of the software. So I think each of those bits is independently changeable. Obviously, it depends. Sometimes you might have a legacy system where the UI is very coupled to the code and we can't change one without the other. Or sometimes a legacy code might be so difficult to work with that if we want to change a tech, it will be so expensive. We may as well fix a domain model as well. So the things can be changed separately, but we have to look at how coupled they are and how difficult it is to change each part independently.
Okay. Have you got a kind of real-life example, showing how to apply some of these criteria, how to think about what we need to revisit and how to proceed? Have you got any real project example you can give us? Of course, without naming names.
Yeah, so we could start with the UK government. That was 10 years ago, so probably not too many secrets there anymore. In that example, the government system had existed for decades. The business rules had existed for, someone told me, maybe even more than 100 years. What was happening was when businesses were submitting their property tax assessments, the government works out how much tax you should pay. And legally, you're allowed to dispute that and complain. So everyone was taking their legal rights and disputing how much tax they pay. Government was getting a lot of these cases building up. They didn't have enough support workers to process all the cases. And so businesses were taking the government to court. The government wasn't even turning up at court because they didn't have enough people to be there. They were losing a lot of money, bad reputation, doesn't look good. So obviously when we've got a crisis like that, it's very easy to make a case for modernizing and modernizing properly. I think the other aspect of the government was there was an initiative on a whole government level to do some modernization work. And the government set global standards on what's acceptable in terms of how the UX works, in terms of technology practices. So we have the individual business areas that have varying needs. And then we might have global policies in our company that dictate where we have constraints, where we must do things to a certain standard, for example.
In this case, the government was setting some expectations and some standards, at least for parts of the user experience and the systems.
Oh, yeah. They were setting a lot of standards. You can see online, GDS, Government Digital Service in the UK, they had a list of like 10 or 11 points. And if you were modernizing some systems, you had to go to an assessment at their offices in London. And if you didn't meet all the criteria, they would say, you're not moving to the next phase. You're not allowed to open your service to the public.
Okay.
If you couldn't demonstrate, for example, that you were iterating with real user feedback. So we had all those user research sessions and we were able to show them that. And they were, very happy with that. We were using the government design style kits. We were measuring our service, how it was being used. We were using things like continuous integration, which are minimum standards. We were putting our code open. So we ticked a lot of these boxes that were minimum requirements.
Okay, so in a way, in this case, you didn't have to think too hard to see what to revisit because there were some precise requirements in many respects in this case.
Yeah, on a global level, there were some requirements about the minimum level, the minimum requirements in each area. And so that made a lot of decisions for you. We also were using this government platform that allowed us to spin up microservices, new front-end applications in a very conventional way with a paved road. So again, that already gave us a lot of the foundations and constraints we needed. So we didn't have to think a lot there either. The technology and the infrastructure, those things were taken care of and decided for us.
And on another aspect, so you mentioned this before as well, that in the book you list a set of activities, tools, things that can be used to think about modernization and do that. But there is a lot of them. So of course there is mention of Conway's law, then there is event storming, wordlay maps, team topologies, there is behavioral code analysis. I mean, you don't quote it with the name, but you mention a code scene from Adam Thornhill and more as well. So do we need to use them all? Or how are we supposed to choose among them, to proceed with our modernization efforts?
Well, I'll answer the question. Maybe JG has some thoughts on this as well, but I'll give you my response first and then I'll stop talking for a bit, I guess. So if you're modernizing, you have to do a lot of things. You have to make a business case. What is the business trying to gain? How does the business plan to grow in the future? How is our current system preventing or making it too expensive to achieve those business goals? So things like Wardley mapping to talk about your strategy. You cannot do strategy, but you'll probably make a lot of bad decisions. So that, you can't really negotiate that. Then you have to map out how your system currently works. You have to think about your current business processes. Think about, do we change the business processes or do we keep them the same? You have to look at your existing code base and work out, how do we refactor it? How do we start to break it apart? So the book does list a lot of techniques like that. But if you're modernizing, these are the things that you have to do: strategy, current state, future state, business process, decoupling your architecture, migrating from the current state to the future state. So you don't have to use all the techniques I recommend, but you have to answer all those questions. You can't avoid them, really.
And how can people choose among those techniques? Is there some simple criteria they can use, if there is one?
I mean, it depends on what problem you're solving first. I think we always go to the left, let's say, with the why, and then we move right to the how. So if someone says to me, what do we do next? I have to understand, where are we in the process? Do we have a clearly defined business strategy and problem we're solving? Well, we need to start there first. Okay, if we have that, then we can spend some time thinking about which are the most important areas of our business to focus on. Then we can start thinking about which parts of the system would most need to change to improve those parts of the business. Then we can start thinking about, how do we start breaking up the system, mapping out the current state in detail, making a future plan. And if we have that plan, then we can start thinking, how do we execute? How do we actually put work in our backlog and start doing the work?
Okay. Have you got an example, again, from a real project in doing this? I mean, at least showing how you go from, from the strategy to the rest of the work, maybe mentioning some of the tools just to put them in some kind of place to give people some mental model on how to think about these things.
I think different clients I've worked with have been at different stages. For example, worked with a company that does electric vehicle charging infrastructure. They already had a very clear business strategy. They wanted to grow, open up some new, I think they were calling them sites, where you can go and actually charge your car, where the electric vehicle charging stations are installed, for example. So they had a very ambitious business plan, expanding it across multiple countries. And they were now wondering, okay, the business goals are clear. How do we get there on a technical and an organizational level? How do we start taking the current systems and having more clearly defined areas, different business domains? And how do we start organizing our team so that they can each work independently in different areas of the company and help us grow as quickly as possible? So the question was, in that case, where do we start? What's the right starting point? People I worked with at the company, the architects and the CTO and the CPO, they identified some candidate areas where they thought it might make sense to start. But they had 3 of them, and they weren't sure which is the right domain to start with. If we start here, it will benefit in this way. But if we start over here, we can do things more customer facing. So the question here was all about, how do we start? So in this case, me and my colleague Eduardo, we worked in an enabling role. We formed an architecture-modernization enabling team. And the goal of that team was to think about this modernization journey and to organize some workshops to decide what would be the right starting point, what would be the correct domain to start with. And then the next step would be to have this in-person workshop where we do event storming and map out the domain, identify the subdomains and the team structure, and actually build that roadmap to, let's start modernizing this part of the business. Did that answer the question? You want me to dig into any areas a bit more detail?
Yeah, I answered the questions. Yeah, so you said, of course, the strategy was already clear. Maybe if the strategy hadn't been clear, I would imagine potentially some workshops, potentially also using some Wordley mapping to decide which direction.
Exactly. If the strategy wasn't clear, we would have had to go more in that space. There are some caveats around this. If you know that parts of your system need to be modernized and you want to demonstrate the foundations and put those in place, well, you can start without a clear strategy.
Yeah.
So that those things could happen in parallel.
Yeah.
SE Radio has an opening for a volunteer host to produce 5 episodes per year. To apply, please follow the instructions on our website at se-radio.net/contact.
And now a question, I think this one probably is Jean-Georges, because I see that in your approach you give a significant role to data engineering. At least reading the book, there is an entire chapter dedicated to it. Yeah, data engineering, data meshes. First question, what is the relationship between data and architecture?
So I think you can't do anything without data. So you can do all the architecture you want, all the nice design, all the modernization you want. If you don't have data, you're not going to go very far.
In modern systems, I see that now everybody talk about data. Yeah. So, well, at least in the system, enterprise systems that I see, there is always, very often at least, data engineering team. So probably everybody wants to capitalize from the knowledge.
Right.
Now, when in a modernization effort, what is the typical aspects related to data that maybe in a typical project, in a typical system, people want to take care of that maybe were not there? I can imagine, I don't know, when I started working, data was mostly, database queries to satisfy user stuff, but now there is more analyzing interactions, trying to get insight. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So I think data has significantly changed, and the data engineering practice has not. And this results in creating very centralized team. And I completely relate to what Nick was saying about the two CTOs fighting a little bit, because in big organization, you will very often have a data organization and you will have some enterprise or software organization. I mean, enterprise architecture, software organization, and they don't often get along. And this is also due to this different ways of working. Okay. Technically, you can call it the socio aspect of the platform or the socio aspect of working, but it's really about the ways of working. In my experience, I've seen very often centralized data team that were just growing. I wouldn't say exponentially, but they were growing very fast, but just to cope with what was needed to maintain. And the maintenance costs prevented them to actually go to some modernization. And so every time, I'm not trying to throw the stone or throw the ball towards, the centralized data team, but a lot of what we've seen, and for me, the book is also the conclusion, probably not the conclusion, but a good step of where we've been going in modernizing since the, I would say, early 2000 to now. Okay. And you've seen the advent of agile methodologies. You've seen the advent of all this Scrum, this product thinking, etc., which in software and of course then in architecture has been very strong, but has not been the case in data. Okay, data has always started to focus on, I'm going to do my job. Okay, so when you're thinking about, when I'm discussing with a lot of data engineering teams or data engineering organization, they say, yes, we are agile, we are doing sprints. Okay. And basically their sprints are mini waterfalls of 2 weeks, and it's not working. So when I say it's not working, it's not scalable. Okay. So all the lessons we've learned in software and that mostly Nick put in the book, we are not using that in the world of data enough. Okay. So, and I still think very strongly that data mesh is one of the solutions, is probably one of the ideal you want to go towards. Okay. So if you listen to Gartner or some people, they say, oh, data mesh is already dead. But if you look also at Gartner, the same Gartner, and they say, you look at the component of what data mesh is and the 4 principles that are translated directly into things that are on the rise within the Gartner environment, for example. I think that's where we are. Okay. We want to modernize architecture for all the good reasons that Nick said, and you as well, Giovanni. And the thing is right now, but the data needs to follow up. Okay. So there's no way we can have a state-of-the-art architecture or a modernized, whichever level of maturity you want to give it, without also modernizing data.
Have you worked in any projects, in any efforts where actually data, modernizing data was the major driver for an architecture modernization effort?
I've seen a few. Typically these days, when companies are going from on-prem to the cloud, okay? And large companies, not everybody is fully migrated and some are actually coming back. But the thing is, and you see the pitfalls as well when you're part of this kind of project, is that I'm trying to do a lift and shift, okay? But for data, having a lift and shift is much more complicated. Let's say I'm living on-prem data warehouse like an Exadata or Teradata, and I'm going to the cloud and doing a Redshift or BigQuery, for example, because usually you also change the technology of the tools you're using. That is very complicated as part of the architecture redesign, because the easy tendency is to say, I'm going to have direct pipelines that are mimicking what I have on-prem to what I'm going to do in the cloud, okay? And it's very complicated because first, the technologies are different. Second, the expectations are different. The billing is different. And the performance is different. So I've seen a lot of projects where things were optimized for on-prem, okay? So even using stuff like a SQL Server completely on the biggest machines they could have and using SQL Server as a data warehouse technology on-prem. And then you go to the cloud and then you say, okay, well, I'm going to do Redshift. But all the optimizations they put in place for a SQL Server, the way they structure, because at this point, you're tweaking the architecture, you're tweaking it you still follow the guidelines of the architecture, but the implementation is so close to the engine itself that you're not benefiting from what, for example, a Redshift could give you, right? You're still having the same models that you would have in SQL Server.
If I understand correctly, let's see if I'm understanding correctly your point. Basically, you're saying when you have a modernization effort that involves data, so for example, shifting the system, putting that into a cloud from on-premises, trying to keep pretty much the same shape of the system, but in the cloud, actually is a problem. And probably a better way to do that would be to revisit the way data is managed. And maybe you need to redo some things differently, because if you have stuff like, say, on the premises SQL Server optimized for SQL Server, then you said Redshift. It's like, well, now we need to do something different with the data, otherwise we'll be suboptimal.
You're exactly on point. And that's why I think that, and I guess that Nick agrees on that as well, is that's why I think like data product thinking and data contract as well help us in the data engineering world to go there, because what you're actually giving your customer is this agreement, this proposal around data management.
Okay. So now I'd like to talk about the implementation aspects. Yeah. So the first question is, we may be thinking that we may need to modernize the architecture. Yeah. Maybe we have a gut feel or something that seems to be not working well, features that maybe are a bit slow to be developed or some aspects like this. But what are some criteria, some, kind of crisp criteria, if you like, that we can use to decide that an architecture is worth modernizing?
On the data side, it's mainly, for example, I would say it's the main driver is the change of philosophy versus on-prem to going to the cloud, or new laws that come in effect. Okay. As you know, I live in the US, but I travel a lot to Europe, and I see the impact of what GDPR has done on data and the consequential higher maturity when it comes to governance of data in Europe versus the US. There's also a difference, okay? So that seems like it's a very positive difference towards Europe, but there's also a lot of very positive difference towards the US. But the thing is, but that's probably not the topic for today. I think that what I'm seeing is that those are the drivers, right? There's kind of three main drivers when you're looking at modernizing a project for me is either you want to save money, you want to make more money, or because the regulator pushes you to go in a different way. Okay. So I think that's the main three drivers for me. And very often for data, it's the regulation. Okay. So I work in the financial sector in the US. I work also in healthcare. Regulation on data here is very big and pushes a lot of those aspects of modernization. Okay. You've got to build more reports. You've got to have this regulatory implementation, etc. That's what the kind of the driver are. And in terms of work, the consequence of that is that you either go the traditional way and you've got this mini data engineering projects that are going there, or you've got a more global picture and you say, okay, well, now I'm done with that. and I want to do a modern data engineering approach with once more data contracts, data product, or data mesh.
Okay. So we understand from the data perspective. What about other aspects? So, well, as we said, data is a lot of regulatory things. It could be even save money or make more money. The other aspects, so, in addition to data, so anything else that we need modernizing, what other criteria can we use there? Or are the same? Or are the criteria the same?
I think it can be various things. Sometimes it can be around costs. Sometimes it can be around support costs. So you might have lots of very manual support processes. You might have customer support teams or call centers with hundreds or maybe even 1,000 people. And you're like, you know what? If our software didn't cause so many errors, or we could fix problems more automated, we could save millions over the course of a few years. So that might be one around cost savings. I think most often it's around growth opportunities. Like, what are the things that we could do as a company that currently aren't possible or are too expensive? New products, moving into new markets. Currently working at Payfit, a French company, for example, being very successful in payroll, now has other big ambitions. Company's grown. They want to build newer products, grow the company so they can build more capabilities, become more profitable as a company. So often a lot of these factors are happening at the same time as the company's growing. The system that was fine before, that worked for one scale, for building one product, for a certain kind of customer, suddenly, as you want to scale the company and the organization, now the current system is maybe a bit too coupled in places. It wasn't a problem before, but it is now. Or as you try and do more things, the support costs grow. So yeah, it can become expensive to do things. A sign to look out for is when maybe you got some product manager or some salesperson who says, could we build this new API for this partner? It's a really strategic partner. All they need is a search API that works across 3 bits of data.
All they
Easy.
need.
That sounds easy.
That's all they need. And you're like, well, those 3 bits of data live in 3 different legacy systems. We have different teams that own different parts of it. Those systems are currently very unreliable. We deploy them once every 3 months. And you're like, oh my gosh, if I work for any sane company with a good architecture, we can implement that in a day's worth of work. Here, it's going to take 3 or 6 months. We have to say no to things that should be very easy and should be very valuable. So that's something to look out for, definitely. When things that are too expensive and we're saying no to things that could have a decent impact for the business.
Actually, I've got now a different question. That is, have you ever come across a situation where you actually decided, you know what, it's not worth modernizing. Let's keep it this way. So people were considering about modernizing the system, then had a deeper look and say, actually, it's not worth the effort and the cost. Have you got any example of this?
As a consultant, that happens all the time. Yeah, they call you in. They've got these big, ambitious business goals. They want you to tell them how they can modernize their systems very easily. And you tell them, well, it's going to take 3 years. You're going to have to put some projects on hold whilst you do the modernization work. You can still do some feature work, but you have to balance modernization versus product work. And they're like, we can't justify to the CEO. And one client I worked for, I was talking to a chief finance officer, and she was saying, why are my developers talking about microservices? Why do I need to sign off his budget to do some modernization work to move to microservices? Yeah, so this happens for a variety of reasons.
I would even add to that that I was probably a little bit more in the enterprise side as well, is that instead of modernizing, it's buy something off the shelf. Okay. And I've seen this scenario as well. So you start, or you're thinking that you're going to work on a project which is going to be built on new feature or a new feature set. And then at the end of it, you're actually going to do an integration project between your CRM and your loyalty program, for example. Okay. So there's also this where it's not worth modernizing the existing, or just, hey, let's get something off the shelf.
That's true. Sometimes just buying something new is the best idea. And I think this is part of the strategic work you do at the beginning of a modernization effort. So maybe with orderly mapping, that you decide what is core to the business, what you can buy, and take some decisions in this respect. Am I correct?
Yeah, definitely. I was in New Zealand a while ago, earlier this year. And on day one, I did some event storming with this company. and they mapped out this current system that needed lots of improvements. They were going to fix every different aspect of it. When we did the Wardley mapping, they were like, we could fix all of these things and modernize this legacy system. But if we do that, we'll have no time to work on all of this new AI stuff we want to do. Whatever you think about AI, let's just put that on hold. All this other new stuff we wanted to do, well, we only have a limited amount of people to work on this. And so that pushed them towards, we could buy something off the shelf here. And that would free us up to work on these more interesting AI things that we want to work on.
Okay. And now another question that I suspect I know the answer, but I'm not quite sure. So have you actually come across any systems that were designed and managed in such a way to be evergreen? Therefore needing no modernization. And often we talk, and I talk as well, about, evolutionary architecture and this kind of systems that ideally should allow you to create a system that follows the business needs and maybe with a lesser amount of technical debt accumulated. So have you come across such a system in any of your projects?
Yeah, I've worked over the last 15 years, probably with 2 or 3 companies that fit that criteria. And I'll tell you what was consistent about those companies. They had teams that were autonomous. Those teams were doing extreme programming practices like TDD and pair programming. They were very focused on continuously improving their work. They were talking about refactoring all the time. They were always trying to learn new stuff. They had like training katas during work hours and stuff. People might say, these are all just geeks who are going crazy about craftsmanship and everything and all extreme programming. But those were the companies I've seen that didn't need to do this big modernization work because they built quality into everything they did and it was an ongoing topic.
So, and the fact that it was ongoing was, I guess, a concern also for the senior leadership to keep this quality high, I would imagine. So it was not simply the teams deciding to do that.
It was a mix of having a good CTO who understands the value of these practices. I think the having a good CTO was consistent in all those experiences, a CTO who understands quality and having a CEO who trusts the CTO. And people used to say things like, we're not a tech company, we're a music company, we're so focused on tech here. But the CEO could see we had multiple teams. I think at the start there were 6 or 7 teams and that grew over the years, deploying to production every day. When the business can see results like that, that buys you some space to, you don't have to justify anything. When a customer raises a bug and you fix it in an hour, deploy it to production, well, that kind of buys yourself some credibility. And in a lot of companies, business leaders can see that, okay, they talk a lot about tech, a lot about refactoring, things like DDD, extreme programming, but, they can see clear results from that.
Yeah, that's quite interesting.
Nick, if I have a question for you. You mentioned that there were 3 companies over your last 15 years. What's the percentage? What does 3 companies represent in the percentage of company you've dealt with?
It's probably about 3%. Yeah. Very small number. And even sometimes it's not even the whole company. It's when you've got a large company, you might have pockets. So I worked with one of the UK's big supermarket chains a few years ago. They had some teams who are doing amazing work and other teams that are building up a lot of technical debt. So yeah, in a big company, also like when I worked at Salesforce, some teams are doing great work, continuously improving, having high quality, and others were just building bigger and bigger legacy systems every day.
And now a question for, I guess, both of you is, have you got any recommendations for fitting the modernization work with other priorities of the business? Because I think we mentioned this a few times before, that this is one of the contentious points. It's like, well, if we spend time modernizing, we cannot really spend that time adding new features. But are there any suggestions you have to give people on how to talk about the need of modernization, how to negotiate with the other priorities? Of course, I said both of you because, we talk about that more, some of the software aspects, but for data as well, and data being particularly sensitive and complicated too.
So I would say a few things are always important or very helpful. I would say the first one is having a consistent message at the C level. So are the CEO, the CTO, and the CPO all giving a consistent message? Or is the CTO talking about modernization and the chief product officers talking about lots of new features? Well, if you're giving mixed signals at the top of the organization like that, you're already off to a bad start. People in the middle managers, the directors above them, the people working in individual teams like developers and product managers, they will have to decide modernization or new features. We're getting different messages. And most of the time, people will just default to building new features because that's visible. That's what they've always done, and that's what they'll get rewarded for. So you need to have a very consistent message that modernization work is important in this company, and a very clear message of what it's worth to the company, of why not building a feature now is worth 10 or 100 times X more value in 1 or 2 years' time. So a clear connection between modernization and business goals, consistent message, and a consistent message from the different leaders at different levels of the company as well. So there's no doubt. I would say those are the fundamentals. And then when you're building your roadmaps for the year or for the quarter or for the semester, again, that's another chance where you have to make more fine-grained decisions. I think building different possibilities is key. So build 3 different roadmaps, I would say. What's your lots of modernization, not much product work? What's an equal balance? And then what's mostly product and not modernization? So you can talk about the different trade-offs, and you can ask different stakeholders to give inputs on which one they value the most.
I would say in data, all that applies, but one thing which is pretty difficult in the data world is to measure the ROI of data. Okay, so what's my return on investment when it comes to data project? One of my recent experience was in the risk division of a major fintech. And how do you measure that you didn't get fined, you didn't get any money stolen, or, it's very difficult, okay, to determine that. But you've got to find these KPIs and you've got to stick to them. And as Nick was saying, you've got to report that to your CPO, CTO, and CEO, okay? You've got to report to your leadership how you do on these KPIs. And before you start the project, you've got to do that. And I think that if you keep that in mind, as Nick was saying for the Greenfield, his lucky 3 Greenfield projects, you can get almost anything. Okay. So then you get the credibility. You're constantly on your KPIs. You're constantly delivering value to the organization. And then it's easier to say, okay, well, now I want to start this project. Okay. But it's always going back to it starts with a business decision.
Okay. And now let's try to end with a bang. So a good question to end with a negative note. How often do architecture modernization programs succeed or fail in your experience?
I've been burned a lot of times by things that didn't work out. Like I've been involved in projects where they say things like, yeah, we promise we'll let you focus on that this year. And then before you've even really got started, it's like, can we build this one new thing, this big new product feature? It might take a couple of months, but once this is done, then we'll get to this deeper modernization work. And then it just carries on and you actually don't do any modernization work.
How often does this happen? Is it a common thing? Is it something you found in many places, this kind of attitude?
Yeah, it's quite frequent, I would say. Ones that work the best are ones like the UK government, where you have this minimum level. When you have a very strong problem or a crisis like the government had, that's always a very strong motivator that helps you to modernize because there's a clear need. It's hard to avoid it. And when you have those standards, those minimum acceptable levels, those global policies, that means you have a need and you have some standards. So you're going to modernize and you're going to do it to a good standard, not taking shortcuts because that's not allowed. So when those recipes are there, yeah, it normally does work out. Maybe not everything goes perfectly, of course, but less than half the time, maybe 25% of the time, I would say things go really well over the course of 2 or 3 years.
And so if you would sum up, let's say the most 3 or 4 common causes of failure, what would they be in your experience?
Yeah, the first one is, like I said before, not having a strong enough reason and a compelling reason and sticking to that reason and not just defaulting back to product work. That would be the first one. Then I think it's around having the expertise in the company to do modernization work. Sometimes, the top of the company, the CTO, might have a big vision, but you look at how the teams are working, they don't understand why it's important to decouple different parts of the system. They don't understand concepts like DDD. They don't understand why it's important to decouple your business logic, your application layer logic, and your UI. Like, we've always just built these things tightly intermingled. What would be the benefit of doing that? So I think the other one's having the skills to do that. Yeah, so the vision, the skills, and then the third one is probably things normally get stuck. You can get stuck in a halfway phase where you start modernizing and don't finish, and you've got the bits of a new system and bits of an old system. So I think really thinking through the migration plan of how you get from A to B doesn't need to be fully defined up front, but you need to really think ahead to what can stop us finishing the migration and what can we do to predict and anticipate as many of those things as possible so that we don't end up in a state where we're stuck halfway and the system's more complex than it was before. And I would say one of the examples that I see a lot there is when companies have some kind of platform or some patterns where the new system can easily talk to the old system. Maybe you have an event-driven architecture and you can easily publish an event from the legacy which is consumed by the new system, or the new system can publish an event and it can be handled by the legacy. So having those things able to talk to each other easily reduces a lot of the friction there, I would say. But it's not the only thing, but one of the things to think about.
So it seems to me that the last point maybe is kind of lack of appropriate planning, really. It's like when you say, when you talk about not being stopped halfway, finding big risks that were not anticipated. So it seems that people don't take the time to actually plan.
It's partially planning, but it's also around discipline. Okay. Once we start this thing, if someone tempts us to build a new product feature, we have to be really disciplined and say, we're halfway through this migration from the old to the new. We currently have a lot of complexity. It might be even more complex than before we started because we have new and old data in different places. This UI shows one price. This UI over here shows a different price. We want to avoid this synchronization issues, which can happen when we're mid-migration. So it can be planning, but it can also be, as I was saying, discipline to not diverge from the plan or to not make too many concessions.
Okay, and how can we increase the chances of success then?
Going back over your series of questions here, I've been lucky, I would say, enough that I've been in projects where modernization was always a success, but it was not always the expected goal we set at the beginning. Okay. But as Nick was saying, you've got to be very careful at not to having like two systems that runs in parallel. But my experience, maybe I was lucky enough, is that we always managed to bring incremental value even through modernization. Okay. And that's, I think, something to keep in mind. Because yes, you can have this big planning. And I agree that for some project, you don't have a choice having this major planning. But if you're good at Agile, you don't always have this, you've got a roadmap, but you don't have a second by second planning, right? So I think that here you can still combine that with incremental added value to your modernization, like for any project.
Yeah. Nick, anything to add to this?
I agree. I think it's always going to be an ongoing balancing act. You just need to make sure that it doesn't balance too much in the way of new product features and you don't do any modernization work and you're stuck in this halfway state. I work with people a lot and we often talk about modernization and they're going to get something out of this, but they don't want to do it. It might be an engineer or a customer support person. And they're like, yeah, because the last one didn't finish. Now I have to use 3 systems and not 2 systems. So not finishing can have big consequences. So, the key thing is to make sure we do keep making progress. Either we don't do it or we finish it, but we don't want the worst thing, which is to be stuck halfway and have this Frankenstein system.
I've worked in several of those systems to help fixing them. I've experienced with especially big banks had this thing like that one system, they decided they needed to modernize and create a completely new one. And then they had two systems to manage. And they decided the second one was not good enough and create the third one. And then they have three systems in production
exactly.
that have to be kept in sync with each other.
Exactly.
Okay, guys. So now I think it's time to wrap up. I think we've done quite a good job introducing architecture modernization. So thank you very much. Was there anything we missed that you'd like to mention?
Don't forget the data.
We won't. Thank you, Nick and Jean-Georges, for coming to the show. It's been a great pleasure for me. And this is Giovanni Asproni for Software Engineering Radio. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.